Alright, so this is going to be my third attempt of trying to record this video. So sorry if my voice is a little bit hoarse. It's a little bit sore at the moment. Anyway, a rookie mistakes made on my side during the recordings. So today we'll be testing Ghost of Tsushima with the RTX 2070 Super. I've already done it with the 4070 Super, and today we're pairing this GPU with a 12400F CPU. That again is paired with DDR4 3600 megatransfers per second CL18 memory. That's correct, and 32 gigabytes of it. All right, so let's just go over the settings here quickly. Let me get rid of that. We're running at 1080p at the moment, no DLSS, no frame generation, and we are running on the medium preset, which is incorrect. So we'll just start off on the high preset, or the very high preset, and start our benchmark run here. Now the game does crash quite a lot for me, and I'm not entirely sure exactly why. I do think it's got something to do with FSR Frame Generation alongside RTSS, but like that's why my previous recordings have failed. I've now just set up another capture card machine, and I just want to see if it goes any better. All right, so you can see here at the very high preset 1080p, we're not able to maintain 60 frames per second here, getting around 50. Well, I mean the average is 62, but at times we are dipping below 60 frames per second. This is a very demanding area. I'll show you quickly. If we move a little bit into the forest here, we'll be getting around 70 frames per second, right? So 69, nice, and 70 frames per second, but we go down here, it drops into the mid 50s. So a very high preset, maybe not the way to play this game. So let's go ahead and just enable some DLSS here quickly. Okay, so I'm just going to leave the overlay open, and you can see what difference it actually makes. So if we just go to upscale method DLSS, and we'll just use quality here, so 58 frames per second, and once we hit apply, we are getting around 67, 68 frames per second. Not the biggest jump in the performance here, but I mean it will definitely be enough to get us above 60 frames per second here, and I think we'll be able to maintain above 60 frames per second at all times here, right? Let me just make sure, are we actually at the correct settings here? Yeah, we are. All right, so I just had to reset the numbers there, and we are getting as you can see, around 77 frames per second average. It does dip into the low 60s there at times, the mid 60s anyway, but as soon as you crest the seal, it goes into the 90s again. A very demanding area this, so the performance will be all over the place. This is normal, right? This is normal for me anyway, because I try to benchmark in the most demanding areas that I can find. So if you do get higher frame rate, make sure you are in the same area. I do run around to see which areas are the most demanding, and I benchmark in there, so that you can be pleasantly surprised when you get a high frame rate in different areas, right? I just don't want you to see me testing not so demanding areas, and then the performance is actually lower when you get to these kind of areas. All right, so got an average there of 74 frames per second. Our 1% laser sitting at 53, and our 0.1% laser sitting at 47. And let's just kick on DLSS, or not DLSS. I keep on saying DLSS frame generation. Let's kick on FSR frame generation, and then we'll just drop this down to the high preset. So I'm going to do the exact same thing. You can see 71 frames per second there. Kick on frame generation. Hopefully it doesn't crash, and I think it hasn't. Can you believe it? Now all of a sudden we're getting 120 frames per second. So we went from 71 to 121 frames per second. That's a very big bump in our frame rate there. I mean, we are now getting a high refresh rate experience on the very high preset here. DLSS set to quality and FSR frame generation enabled. I usually enable upscaling when I use frame generation, just purely because it does help lower the input latency, or the increase in input latency, by enabling FSR frame generation or DLSS frame generation as well, by providing a little bit of a higher frame rate. So the higher the base frame rate, the less the input latency would be. I mean, that makes sense, but frame generation does actually increase the input latency slightly, and if you do get a higher frame rate, that impact is slightly less. All right, so getting a very decent experience here if you do have a 120 hertz or above monitor. you'll get a higher refresh rate experience, and getting an average of 117 frames per second. Our 1% laser sitting at 93, and our 0.1% laser sitting at 85. All right, let's drop this down to the high preset. But before we do that, I just want to show you there's a mistake that many YouTubers make, and many people actually benchmarking this game. I've got a 4K capture card here, right? So that's why it says 4K 60 Pro MK2, whatever. It's an Elgato capture card, and it can go up to 4K. So I'm testing at less than native resolution, and I'm using exclusive full screen, because if I drop this to full screen, let's just see what happens. Hopefully the game doesn't crash, but if you do use full screen, you are now getting 93 frames per second. So make sure that if you're not running at your monitor's native resolution when testing, or for whichever reason, this actually applies to the Windows resolution. So if your Windows resolution is set to 1080p, you can use full screen or exclusive full screen. There's no difference then, because if I set this to 4K, there's no difference between full screen and exclusive full screen. This only applies to when we use frame generation. So like if we just go ahead and enable exclusive full screen again, like 114 frames per second, right? So that's exactly what you want. Use exclusive full screen when not using your monitor's native resolution. All right, now it's time to drop this down to the high preset. And this is basically the crash that I keep on getting. I just dropped this to the high preset and then the game crashed. Okay, so we're back on the high preset, 1080p, no DLSS, no frame generation. And we got a nice bump in the performance there. We were like hovering around 60 frames per second previously, just above 60, and now we are hovering around 90 frames per second. You can see our average there is 81. Still, there's quite a bit of a drop, quite a few drops occurring depending on what's happening on the screen. I mean, that's perfectly normal. There's not a single game except for Tetris that'll run at a consistent frame rate, no matter where you are. Anyway, getting an average of 82 frames per second, and if the benchmark run goes on for a little bit longer, I think that should go down to around 80, maybe 78 frames per second. But I'm not going to be testing too long at these settings. As you can see, you'll definitely get a decent experience here at 1080p on the high preset. So let's go ahead and just enable DLSS here quickly and see what happens. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of using upscaling at 1080p, but in this game, it actually does look quite okay, especially even at 1080p, I should say. So let's see, 77 frames per second, and hit apply, and that goes to 91 frames per second. So still not that high refresh rate experience. I'd consider anything above 100 frames per second high refresh rate, because you're getting close to maxing out 120 hertz panel. Obviously, with 540 hertz panels now also being available, 120 hertz is quite on the low end, but there is a big difference in motion fluidity. It's very good actually. Like it feels very smooth. The responsiveness of this game is very good. The game looks plenty good. I know it's a base PS4 game with some upgrades. There's kind of a lot of controversy on Twitter again around this game. It seems like there can never be a game release without any controversy. I just don't understand that. This is a pretty good game so far. Like, I haven't played it that much, but so far what I've played, it's kind of like a Ubisoft game, like in the way the world and stuff works, but it just feels cleaner and maybe a little bit more easier to, I don't know, like easier to play. I've got no issue whatsoever with Ubisoft games. I do enjoy them. Avatar was actually very fun. I enjoyed that game quite a lot. Anyway, so getting an average of 100 frames per second, give or take 99. Anyway, our 1% laser sitting at 76, and our 0.1% laser sitting at 66. So going to look in this direction, getting 95 frames per second. Let's enable frame generation. So 94, 95 frames per second, frame generation being applied now. And this is, I think, did the game crash? The game did not crash, luckily. Okay, 150 frames per second. So we gained 60 frames per second. We went from 90 to 150 frames per second. Like that's massive. Like, sure, your performance does not improve, but your motion fluidity is, like, this is just great. The input latency at this higher frame rate is not noticeable at all. And if you're going to play on a controller, it'll be even better. Like, this game is not really dependent on low input latency. Depends, like, you do get those standoffs, right? And you do need to block and parry and that kind of stuff. If you do feel like your timing is slightly out with those, go ahead and blame input latency. Although it hasn't been a problem for me just yet, and I'm a pretty average player, and there's still some people here. Anyway, so got an average of 152 frames per second. Our 1% laser sitting at 119, and our 0.1% laser sitting at 114. I'm not going to be testing further at 1080p. Let's move on to 1440p. Right, at 1440p, we can actually slide or stop, whatever. 1440p on the very high preset, no DLSS, no frame generation, and we're getting 40-ish frames per second, yeah, in the mid 40s, before I get called out on that again. Anyway, like, this is probably not how you'd want to play this game. It looks very good. Like, the upgrade, the visual upgrade of going from 1080p to 1440p is just, like, it's extremely noticeable. Even on a 27-inch monitor, like, the pixels per inch is just vastly more. So, but still, the frame rate is not what I'd call great. Like, this game is, as I said earlier, like, not that sensitive to input latency, and you can actually get away with playing at 30 frames per second if that's what you want, if you want to prefer visuals over performance. But personally, I'd do like something higher than even 60 frames per second, but 60 frames per second being the minimum. All right, so let's see if DLSS can get us there. So once again, going to leave this open and enable a DLSS quality, so 46 frames per second, and that goes to 65 frames per second, 64, 65. Decent enough. So, and the game looks plenty good still. There will be areas like there where we drop below 60 frames per second even, but I think this is close enough to 60 frames per second that it wouldn't really be an issue. Like, as I said earlier, this is one of the more demanding areas. So if we just run more towards the woods here, you'll see that it should be able to maintain like 65 frames per second. So lock it to 60 using RTSS or something else. Like, just lock the frame rate to 60 frames per second, and you'll get a very flat frame time graph and a very smooth experience most of the time. Like, there, the frame rate dip was a little bit more than I would have expected. It went down to 53. If you do game on a G-Sync or a VRR monitor, it probably won't be as noticeable. And I mean, but it all comes down to personal preference. If you want to lock it to 60 frames per second, obviously you're going to have to use different settings here, because this is not locked to 60, obviously. Anyway, so we had an average of 62 frames per second, our 1% laser sitting at 45, and our 0.1% laser sitting at 38. So just going to crest this wheel here, and then we will enable frame generation, getting 58 frames per second here. Let me just minimize that. So 58 frames per second, and if we then enable frame generation, hopefully the game doesn't crash. And there we go, luckily not. So 93 frames per second, so a pretty decent bump in the frame rate there, almost 40 frames per second. And I would say, let me just reset the numbers, I would say that I do agree with the NVIDIA and AMD that the best experience for this would be to get a base frame rate of around 60 frames per second before enabling any kind of frame generation. Personally, I'd aim for like 70 plus, but just because the input latency does become more noticeable the lower your base frame rate is. But in a game like this, it doesn't really matter that much, and 90 frames per second as a final output is, I mean, it's very good actually. Like, it feels very good, it looks very good, so definitely something that you can consider using. All right, not going to be testing way too much here. I'm going to drop this down to the high preset. We still have medium preset to test, and then we'll move on to 4K. Right, we're now at the medium preset, exact same settings, 1440p native DLAA, no frame generation, and getting almost 60 frames per second once again. So this is almost the same as what we had with the very high preset with DLSS set to quality. So if you want to rather run at native frames or native resolution, and you are still aiming for 60 frames per second, this is something you can use, although it'll definitely not be locked to 60 frames per second, as can be clearly seen in some of these areas. But I mean, you can just drop down 1 or 2 settings and you should be able to get 60 frames per second, right? I only do test the presets. I'd urge you to watch out for optimization videos. Those guys usually do a much better or a more intricate job than me. I just test presets because it's easier for you guys to try and replicate these runs at home if you do so desire. All right, so got an average of 59 frames per second. Our 1% laser setting at 46 and our 0.1% laser setting at 40. I'm not going to be testing at medium. I just forgot, or I just remembered, there's not that big a difference with this GPU between high and medium, like 5 to 10 frames per second at but not even on at native, like at DLSS quality kind of settings. So we'll just be sticking to the high preset before we move on to 4K. So let's just apply DLSS here. Let me just get rid of that one. So 62 frames per second, and apply this, and we went up again to around 88. All right, so almost 90 frames per second here. And I'd say this is now a prime candidate for enabling frame generation. Some people don't like frame generation, I get that, but it's come a long way, and especially FSR Frame Generation, it has come a long way. It's a very, very good implementation in this game. It's definitely usable. On my 4070 Super daily driver, I actually use DLSS set to quality and then use FSR Frame Generation because the frame rate boost is slightly higher than with DLSS Frame Generation, actually. The game does crash a little bit more, so I'm just waiting a little bit. So I've got some other games in my backlog that I need to finish first, and by then there should be 1 or 2 patches actually. I just bought it so I can actually make a few videos out of it. All right, so we've got an average of 83 frames per second. I'm actually going to stand on the seal. 1% laser sitting at 63, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at a respectable 56. So let's go ahead and enable frame generation whilst we're overlooking this hill here. Right, so sitting with 77, 78 frames per second, enable frame generation here, and let's hope it doesn't crash. I know I keep on saying it, but it keeps on crashing on me. And now we've got 120 frames per second here, give or take. Right, so if you do have a 120 hertz monitor, even a higher refresh rate monitor, right? But this will at times even max out your 120 hertz monitor at 1440p on the high preset with the DLSS set to quality, right? So not true 1440p, more like 960p, but the visuals in this game, like the art style is very, very good. Sure, at times there's definitely signs of being a base PS4 game, but I do think it's covered up nicely with the art style. Anyway, getting an average of 116 frames per second, a very, very good experience here, very responsive, even with frame generation enabled. There's quite a lot of fighting happening there. I'm just going to avoid that because I do suck. I'll try and get better. Anyway, so let's, I think that's going to be it for 1440p. Let's move on to 4K. I'm not going to be testing too much at 4K anyway. This is definitely not a 4K GPU. It wasn't a 4K GPU when it launched, and a few years later, it's definitely still not. Right, so the game did crash, so I had to reload my save, and we're back at 4K here. Okay, so getting almost 60 frames per second here, or just above 60 frames per second, I should say. The game looks extremely good. This is a native 4K monitor that I'm testing on and running at 4K. The settings currently, I'm using DLSS set to balanced, and it's 4K on the medium preset, right? That's basically guaranteed to get you 60 frames per second no matter what happens on the screen here. And our VRAM usage is, I mean, low enough so that you don't have to worry about running out of VRAM here. If you go into the wooden area here, or the woods area, not the wooden, getting getting a frame rate of 72, 73 frames per second. So it is, you should be able to get above 60 frames per second at all times with these settings. Maybe you, like, I obviously haven't explored the whole of the map. Maybe there's an area that's more demanding than this. But I do think this will get you a decent experience most of the time. Anyway, Using DLSS quality, it does drop below 60 frames per second more often than not. So that's why I'm just using DLSS balanced here. So let's go ahead and just kick on FSR Frame Generation, and then we'll call it quits. All right, so as you can see, DLSS balanced, and just going to enable frame generation, sitting with 67 frames per second there, and that went up to 90 frames per second. Okay. Very, very decent boost in our frame rate once again. I actually do think I want to find out if we can actually get a high refresh rate experience here at 4K on the RTX 2070 Super. You'll see some flashes now and again. It's RTSS doing its thing. Like it's only, you can see that the overlay is flashing quite a bit. When I disable RTSS, it does not do that. Anyway, getting an average here of 86 frames per second. Our 1% closer is sitting at 73, and our 0.1% closer sitting at 43. Our frame time graph is not as smooth as I'd like it to be. You can see there with the flashing comes a spike in the frame time graph. So I don't feel those stutters. I just do think that it's it's more like a monitoring issue, and the game not running that well with the RTSS enabled in the background. Yeah, right. So I'm going to leave everything as is. Let's just go ahead and enable. I'll just change that. Let's use DLSS performance, because this is still 1080p upscale to 4K, right? Okay, did not gain that much. And ultra performance, so 720p. Let's see. 110 frames per second. There we go. High refresh rate experience achieved. Like, you are definitely going to notice the lower internal resolution. As I said, it's that was a big stutter then. Let me reset the frame time graph, or the frame rate counter. You'll definitely notice the less than ideal visuals, especially in movement, fast movement, especially considering we still have FSR frame generation enabled as well. And sure, if you want a high refresh rate experience at 4K with an RTX 2070 Super, these are the settings you can use, right? I would not advise you to use them. Like, it's not a 4K GPU, guys. It wasn't, and it's still not. Sure, it was able to play 4K or games at 4K when it launched, but like it really was more like the 2080 Super and 2080 Ti that was aimed at 4K gaming. All right, anyway, that's it. I think that's going to be it for this video. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.